This video was brought to you by CuriosityStream. It's now been 2 months since protests began in the Islamic Republic of Iran, and while they have cooled down a bit, they've essentially just become a constant in Iranian politics. Nonetheless, despite the fact that a majority of Iranians clearly want the Ayatollah's regime gone, the Ayatollahs have made it clear that they don't plan on giving up power anytime soon. So it looks like the protesters and regime have entered into some sort of stalemate. In this video then, we thought we'd take a look at what more the protests actually need to do to achieve their desired outcome of regime change in Iran. Before we get into what's required for regime change, a quick look at the most recent developments. It's been roughly 3 weeks since we did our last video on Iran, and in that time, 2 big things have happened in the country. Firstly, the regime has threatened to execute protesters and handed out its first death sentences. And secondly, the UN has accepted a request by 42 UN member states, spearheaded by Germany and Iceland, to hold a special session of the UN Human Rights Council on Iran, which would be the first one ever held on the country. Let's start with the executions though. In the last couple of weeks, Iranian courts, encouraged by the regime, have started handing out extreme sentences to protesters, presumably in an attempt to deter further protesting. The first death sentence was handed out on October 30th to a 22-year-old. His specific crime was apparently corruption on earth, but his mother claimed that his sentence has been issued after just one hearing with no lawyer present. A week later, on November 6th, 227 members of Iran's 290-strong parliament signed a letter to the judiciary urging that protesters be shown, quote, no leniency and receive a harsh punishment that would serve as a good lesson in the shortest possible time. The very next day, those same 227 MPs voted in parliament to execute all protesters currently in custody. For context, there are an estimated 16,000 protesters in custody at the moment, including 500 students, according to data collected by HRANA, an Iranian human rights organization. Now, while no protesters have actually been executed yet, over the weekend, 4 young men were executed at 2 prisons in what was widely perceived as a thinly veiled threat to protesters. Now, you might think that even the Iranian regime couldn't get away with executing 16,000 people, but they do have some form here. In the 1980s, the Ayatollah's regime, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, secretly executed thousands of political opponents, mostly from the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran, or MEK, and other leftist factions, including the Fedayeen and the Iranian Communist Party. Now, the precise number of people killed in the 80s is disputed. Obviously, those executions were done in secret, but we know that they were definitely in their thousands. In his memoirs, Khomeini's deputy put it at 3,800 executed, while another defector put it nearly 10 times higher at about 33,000. The point we're making here is that the Ayatollahs have used execution as a form of political repression in the past, which makes all of this talk about mass executions even more worrying. The other big development is the UN's recent interest in what's been going on in Iran. On Friday, Germany and Iceland submitted a request on behalf of 42 countries to hold a special session of the UN Human Rights Council. As the request was supported by the required 1/3 of the Council's voting members, it looks like the UNHRC will hold a special session on the Iran protests sometime later this month, which will be the first session regarding Iran in the Council's history. According to UN Watch, a human rights organization that lobbied heavily for the special session, they'll be using the session to ask for a UN inquiry, the expulsion of Iran from the UN Rights Commission, and an expansion of UN sanctions to include Iranian diplomats and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Now, unsurprisingly, this didn't go down too well with the regime. Iran's foreign minister publicly warned the UN Secretary General not to hold the session, claiming that the violence has been fomented by Western countries and that Iran was a, quote, true defender of human rights. So those are the 2 biggest things that have happened over the last 3 weeks since we covered Iran. On to the second part of the video. With that as a backdrop, what do the protesters actually need to do to succeed? As we mentioned in the intro, protests are still continuing, but in their current form, they're unlikely to topple the Ayatollah's regime, at least in the short term. Now, this doesn't mean that the protests won't succeed eventually. The protests that culminated in the 1979 revolution took over a year, beginning in October 1977, accelerating after the burning of Cinema Rex in August 1978, before the Shah finally fled in January 1979. However, if these protests are to succeed, history suggests they'll probably need two things. Firstly, they'll need a figurehead. This was certainly true in 1979. While a vast array of disparate groups opposed the Shah, including Marxists, secularists, and Islamic moderates, the protests were spearheaded by the exiled Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini gave the protests a direction and presented a viable alternative to the Shah. The most likely candidate here is probably Reza Pahlavi, the oldest son of the last Shah of Iran, who ruled until the revolution in 1979. Pahlavi is the founder and leader of the National Council of Iran, an exiled opposition group, and polling from 2018 found that he's by far and away the most well-known and popular opposition group in Iran. But it's not just a leader they need. They'll also need the support of some more politically powerful constituencies within Iran. Now, it's worth saying that the protests have already successfully spread. They were originally confined to young people and students, but they've since spread to include people from every demographic in Iran. They've also spread to a couple of politically powerful constituencies. Doctors and lawyers have recently staged protests in Tehran and other major cities. And in October, oil workers went on strike too, chanting death to the dictator. However, if they're going to overthrow the regime, they're going to need to garner the wider support of either Iranian businesses or some faction of the Iranian security services. A general strike, for example, which many protesters have been calling for, would put a massive economic pressure on the regime. Similarly, if one wing of Iran's security services decides to withdraw their support, this would undermine the monopoly on violence and would accelerate the state's demise. This is exactly what happened in 1979. Beginning in 1978, strikes carried out by civil servants and oil workers put significant pressure on the Shah, but it was the Iranian military's decision to declare neutrality that eventually signaled the end of the dynasty. So those are the two things that protesters need to succeed. And while neither looks immediately forthcoming, it looks equally unlikely that protests will subside on their own. And a misstep by the Ayatollah's regime, like, say, executing 15,000 protesters, could provoke the required change. Ultimately, though, this is a live story, and we won't know what's going to happen yet right away. But if you want to be kept in the loop, you should check out our show, The Daily Briefing. Our show where we break down 4 stories you need to know about every single day. Now, you can watch that on the Daily Briefing YouTube channel, or you can listen by searching in your favorite podcast app. But if you want an extended version of the show, that's an extra 5 to 10 minutes every single day and an ad-free experience, then you'll need to sign up to our streaming service, Nebula. There, you'll also find other exclusive TLDR videos, which will never come to YouTube, and all of our latest videos ad-free. Now, if that has you interested, then I've got some good news, because we've partnered with CuriosityStream, the home of some of the best documentaries online. Thanks to them, you can get both streaming services, CuriosityStream for the documentaries and Nebula for the bonus TLDR, for less than $15 a year. That's a wild deal, and a 26% discount on their already low price. So get yourself a ton of documentaries and exclusive content from your favorite creators, including the Daily Briefing Extended Edition, by signing up using the link below. Thanks for your support.